King, A Life by Jonathan Eig. Picture this. It's a cold December night in 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama. A nervous energy buzzes through a crowd of 5,000 people, packed so tightly into a Baptist church that they spill out into the streets. They're angry, they're frightened, and they're waiting for a leader. Just days earlier, a woman named Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus, and now this community stands on the brink of a revolution, a boycott that could either change everything or get them killed. The man about to step up to the pulpit is only 26 years old. He's new in town. He has a wife and a newborn baby at home. He knows that taking on this role could be a death sentence. And here's the thing. He has no idea what he's going to say. He's had only 20 minutes to prepare the most important speech of his life. As he stands there, his own purpose remains unclear, not just to the crowd, but to himself. Will he tell them to stand down, to be patient, or will he ask them to stand up and resist? His voice is calm, almost academic at first. We are here this evening for serious business. But then something inside him catches fire. The voice deepens, it thunders. We are not wrong in what we are doing. The crowd roars. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. For most of the 5,000 people there that night, it was the first time they'd ever heard the voice of Martin Luther King Jr. And in that moment, a leader wasn't just chosen, he was forged. Today, we're diving into Jonathan Eig's magnificent new biography, King, A Life. This isn't just another book about Martin Luther King Jr. It's a revelation. Eig was given unprecedented access to thousands of newly released FBI documents, private letters, and unheard recordings. He peels back the layers of myth to show us the man behind the monument. And that's my promise to you today. By the end of our journey, you'll see a side of Dr. King you've likely never seen before. We're going to look past the sanitized "I have a dream" speech and discover the radical, flawed, funny, and profoundly human man who chewed his fingernails, shouted at the TV, struggled with depression, and carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, all while being hunted by his own government. This is the story of how an ordinary man, full of doubts and contradictions, summoned the courage to become one of history's greatest founding fathers. To truly understand Martin Luther King Jr., we have to go back before he was born, back to the dusty, sun-scorched fields of Stockbridge, Georgia, where his family's story was forged in fire and faith. His grandfather, Jim King, was a man broken by the system. He was a sharecropper, born just 1 year before slavery was officially abolished, but he never truly escaped it. He lived his entire life in debt to the white landowners he worked for, and that bitterness turned him into an angry, violent alcoholic. He was a man who saw the American dream as a cruel joke. But Martin's grandmother, Delia, was the complete opposite. She was the family's anchor, a woman of unshakable faith. There's a story Jonathan Eig tells that perfectly captures her spirit. One day, around 1910, she sent her young son, Martin's father, who was then named Michael, to take a bucket of milk to a neighbor. On the way, a white mill owner stopped the boy and demanded he fetch some water. When Michael explained he was on an errand, the man flew into a rage. He kicked over the bucket of milk, smashed his fist into the boy's face, and left him bloody and dazed. When Michael ran home, Delia saw his torn shirt and blood-crusted face. Her voice was low and tight. "Who did this to you, Michael?" She marched her son down to the mill, looked the owner in the eye, and demanded to know if he was the one who hurt her child. The man was dismissive, threatening, but Delia didn't back down. She screamed at him, and when he admitted what he'd done, she lowered her shoulder and rammed him into a shed, knocking him to the ground and hammering his face with her fists, hands hardened by a lifetime of labor. "You can kill me," she warned, "but if you put a hand on a child of mine, you'll answer." That fire, that refusal to bow down to injustice, was passed down. But so was the pain. Delia warned her son not to tell his father, Jim, what had happened. A black woman might get away with beating a white man, but a black man would almost certainly be lynched for it. But Jim found out anyway. He grabbed his rifle and went looking for revenge. That night, a mob of white men on horseback came to the King family shack. Jim had to flee into the woods and hide for months, leaving his family to struggle through the winter. This was the world that shaped Martin Luther King Sr., a world of fierce love and terrifying violence. Young Michael King saw his father's rage and his mother's faith, and he chose faith. At just 14 years old, he ran away from that life of poverty and fear in Stockbridge and made his way to Atlanta, determined to become a preacher. He was ambitious, but he was also uneducated. He could read, but he couldn't write. When he enrolled in a preparatory school, the broad-shouldered young man had to humble himself and squeeze into a fifth-grade classroom. But he was driven. He saw a future in Atlanta, a city that was becoming a hub for black culture, business, and resistance. This is where he first laid eyes on Alberta Williams, the daughter of the most influential black Baptist preacher in the city, Reverend A.D. Williams. Michael King was determined to marry her. His friends told him he was crazy. "She would not even spit on you," one said. But Michael was relentless. For him, marrying Alberta wasn't just about love. It was about ambition. It was about connecting himself to a legacy of leadership and service. It took him 6 years, but he finally won her over, along with her father. He also made a profound change. He was born Michael King, but he began calling himself Martin Luther King in honor of the great Protestant reformer. He saw a connection, a man who challenged the established order out of deep moral conviction. That new name, Martin Luther King, wasn't just a name. It was a declaration of purpose. It was a legacy he would pass on to his son. On January 15, 1929, that son was born. They named him Michael King, just like his father, and for years, everyone called him Little Mike, or ML. He grew up on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, a street so vibrant and prosperous, it was known as the richest Negro street in the world. For a young black boy in the Jim Crow South, Sweet Auburn was a magical place. It was a bubble, partially protected from the harsh realities of racism. Here, black people owned banks, insurance companies, newspapers, and nightclubs. It was a world that taught young ML that black people could be leaders, creators, and pillars of a community. But the bubble couldn't protect him forever. Eig recounts a story that King himself would tell many times, a defining moment from his childhood. His best friend was a little white boy whose father owned a grocery store across the street. They were inseparable. But when they both turned 6 and started school, separate schools, of course, the friendship suddenly ended. ML didn't understand why. He went to his friend's house, and the boy told him that his father said he wasn't allowed to play with him anymore. The reason? The color of ML. Washus skin. He was heartbroken. That night at the dinner table, he asked his parents to explain. His mother, Alberta, pulled him onto her lap and told him something that would become the foundation of his entire philosophy. "You're as good as anyone." It was the first time he became aware of the race problem, and for a moment, he wrote later, He was determined to hate every white person. That hatred didn't last, but the determination to fight racism never faded. In fact, it ignited a fire within him. "You just wait and see," the 6-year-old told his family. "I'm going to get me some big words." And he did. He fell in love with language. He would memorize long passages from the Bible and listen to the soaring sermons of his father, Daddy King, from the pews of Ebenezer Baptist Church. Daddy King was a powerful, booming presence, a man who had pulled himself out of poverty and built one of the most important churches in Atlanta. He was loving, but also strict, and sometimes brutal. Eig reveals that Daddy King would often whip his children with a belt, a practice that ML despised. When he was whipped, ML would refuse to cry, a small act of defiance. One of King's closest advisors, Bayard Rustin, later speculated that this, quote, brutalization from his father is what made Martin so averse to personal conflict later in life. He could stand up to racist sheriffs, but he struggled to confront his own colleagues. This created a tension inside him, a deep desire for his father's approval, yet also a yearning to break free and find his own path. He rebelled in small ways. He told his family he had no intention of becoming a preacher, considering it intellectually beneath him. He was embarrassed by the emotionalism of the black church, the shouting and the stamping. He dreamed of becoming a doctor or a lawyer. At just 15 years old, he got an early taste of life outside the segregated South. He and other students from Morehouse College, a prestigious all-black men's school in Atlanta, spent a summer working on a tobacco farm in Connecticut. It was a revelation. For the first time, he could sit anywhere on a train. He could eat in any restaurant. He saw black people and white people attending the same churches. In a letter home, he wrote, "I never thought that a person of my race could eat anywhere, but the return journey was a harsh slap of reality." As soon as the train crossed into Washington, D.C., the curtain came down in the dining car, and he was once again segregated. "It was a bitter feeling," he said, going back to segregation. This experience solidified his determination to fight for justice, but he was still unsure how. At Morehouse, he majored in sociology and was deeply influenced by the college president, Dr. Benjamin Mays. Mays was a towering figure, a brilliant theologian and orator who taught his students that they had a special responsibility to use their education to change the world. In Mays, ML saw a model for what a preacher could be, not just an emotional leader, but an intellectual and a social reformer. He saw that the church could be a powerful engine for change. He also read Henry David Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience, for the first time. The idea of refusing to cooperate with an evil system fascinated him. Slowly, the path began to clear. He realized that the ministry wasn't a step down, it was a calling. It was the place where all his passions, for scholarship, for oratory, and for social justice, could come together. In 1948, he was ordained as a minister and became the assistant pastor at his father's church. But he wasn't ready to settle down. He decided to continue his education in the North, at Crozier Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, a predominantly white school. Crozier was where Martin Luther King Jr., the intellectual, was truly born. He dove into the works of the great philosophers and theologians. But he was one of only a handful of black students, and he felt the pressure to represent his race. He was meticulous about his appearance, always overdressed. His shoes perfectly shined. He was grimly serious, trying to avoid the white stereotype of the loud and always laughing Negro. But it was also at Crozier that he fell in love with a white woman, Betty Moitz. She was the daughter of the school's cook, and for a time, they were, in her words, madly in love. King was so serious about Betty that he talked to his friends about marrying her. But he knew the reality. A marriage to a white woman would destroy any chance he had of pastoring a church in the South, where he felt his true calling was. His friends, and especially his mentor, Reverend J. Pius Barber, warned him that society would never accept it. In the end, he broke off the relationship. It was a painful choice, a sacrifice of personal happiness for his sense of mission. Barber later described him as a man of a broken heart, adding, "He never recovered." Years later, his friend Harry Belafonte would say that Betty was King's, quote, "true love," a loss that haunted him for the rest of his life. After Crozier, he moved to Boston University to pursue his doctorate. He was now introducing himself as Martin, and he was one of the most eligible bachelors in the city. He drove a green Chevrolet, a gift from his parents, and hosted gatherings of young black intellectuals he called the Philosophical Club. He was charming, confident, and, according to one friend, known for wrecking girls, but he was also looking for a wife. One day, a friend from Atlanta gave him the number of a young woman studying at the New England Conservatory of Music. Her name was Coretta Scott. Coretta was not like the other women he had dated. She was older, more serious, and fiercely independent. She grew up in rural Alabama, in a family that had managed to own their own land against incredible odds. She had seen her family's home and sawmill burned down by resentful whites. She had walked 5 miles to a one-room schoolhouse while white children rode buses. She was a veteran activist, having attended the progressive, integrated Antioch College, where she joined the NAACP and fought against local discrimination. She was in Boston on a scholarship, pursuing a career as a concert singer. When King called her, he laid on his smoothest lines. "I am like Napoleon," he said. "I'm at my Waterloo and I'm on my knees." Coretta wasn't impressed by the jive, but she was intrigued. On their first date, he told her she possessed all the qualities he was looking for in a wife: intelligence, character, beauty, and personality. Coretta was hesitant. She wasn't interested in dating a minister, especially not a Baptist one. She had her own career ambitions. And she worried about Martin's father, who wanted his son to marry a girl from a prominent Atlanta family. When they visited Atlanta together, Daddy King made it clear he didn't approve of Coretta. He thought a farm girl and aspiring concert singer was an unsuitable match for his son. In a tense confrontation, Daddy King told Coretta not to take Martin too seriously. Martin, to Coretta's dismay, said nothing in her defense. It was a test. Would Martin stand up to his powerful father? In the end, he did. He told his mother he was going to marry Coretta, and Daddy King eventually, reluctantly, gave his blessing. But it came at a cost for Coretta. She changed her major from performance to music education, accepting that her husband's career would come first. Martin was clear. He wanted a wife who would be home waiting for him when he got back from work. "It was," Coretta said, "the most important decision I would make." She saw in Martin a man who reminded her of her own strong, industrious father. She also saw a partner in the cause of justice. She believed that by his side, she could still make a contribution to the world. They were married in June 1953 on the lawn of her parents' home in Alabama. In a small but significant act of independence, Coretta had the promise to obey her husband removed from her vows. After finishing his coursework in Boston, King accepted a position as the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. It was a prestigious but challenging church, known for its educated, and some said snooty congregation. Coretta would have preferred to stay in the North, but Martin felt a duty to return to the South. He felt this was where he was needed most. They arrived in Montgomery in 1954, just as the ground was beginning to shift under the feet of the Jim Crow South. The Supreme Court had just ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that segregated schools were unconstitutional. Hope was in the air, but so was a fierce and violent backlash. King was only 25 years old, but he moved quickly to establish his authority at Dexter. He was a different kind of preacher. His sermons were intellectual, sophisticated, and filled with quotes from philosophers and theologians. But they also carried the fire and passion of the traditional black church he had grown up in. He was a bourgeois leader of the masses, as his first biographer put it. For his first year, he focused mostly on his church and on finishing his doctoral dissertation. He was not yet deeply involved in the local civil rights activism being led by people like E.D. Nixon and Joanne Robinson. But he was watching, and he was waiting. Then, on December 1, 1955, everything changed. Rosa Parks, a seamstress and a longtime activist with the NAACP, was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a city bus. Joanne Robinson and the Women's Political Council immediately swung into action, mimeographing thousands of leaflets calling for a one-day bus boycott. E.D. Nixon called King. He was the third person Nixon called. King was hesitant. "Brother Nixon," he said, "let me think about it." He had a newborn daughter, Yolanda, at home. He was new in town. He was only 26. But when his best friend in Montgomery, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, called moments later, buzzing with excitement, King couldn't say no. That night, leaders of the black community met in the basement of King's church. They agreed to support the boycott and formed a new organization to lead it, the Montgomery Improvement Association. They needed a president, someone who could unite the different factions of the community, someone who could speak to the press. Ralph Abernathy nominated his friend. Martin Luther King Jr., the newcomer, the young man with the Ph.D., was elected president. He had no idea what he was getting into. The boycott was a stunning success, with nearly 100% participation. The sight of empty buses rolling through the streets filled King with joy. That night, at Holt Street Baptist Church, he stepped up to the pulpit to address a crowd of thousands. It was the moment we began with. With only 20 minutes to prepare, he found the words that would launch a movement and define his life. He blended the righteous anger of the people with the Christian call for love and nonviolence. He gave them a new vision, not just of protest, but of redemption. The one-day boycott stretched into a week, then a month, then a year. It was a grueling struggle. King and the other leaders organized a massive, complex carpool system to get people to work. They held mass meetings twice a week, where King's oratory filled people with the courage to keep walking, but the white power structure fought back with everything they had. King was arrested for the first time in his life for driving 30 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. Late one night, he received a terrifying phone call. "Nigger," a voice said, "if you're not out of town in 3 days, we're gonna blow your brains out and blow up your house." Shaken, King couldn't sleep. He went to his kitchen to make a cup of coffee and prayed aloud. "Lord," he said, "I'm down here trying to do what's right, but I'm weak now. I'm losing my courage." And in that moment, he said, he heard an inner voice, the voice of God, telling him to stand up for righteousness and that he would be with him until the end of the world. From that moment on, King said, he lost his fear of death. Just a few days later, on January 30th, 1956, while King was at a mass meeting, a bomb exploded on the front porch of his home. Coretta and their baby daughter, Yoki, were inside but were unharmed. When King rushed home, he found an angry crowd of hundreds of his supporters, many of them armed, ready for war. The police commissioner, hoping to avoid a riot, asked King to speak to them. King stood on his shattered porch and delivered a message that would become the hallmark of his movement. "We are not advocating violence," he said. "We want to love our enemies. Be good to them. Love them and let them know you love them. If I am stopped, this movement will not stop, for what we are doing is right, and God is with us." The boycott lasted 381 days. In the end, it wasn't the walking that won the victory, but a lawsuit, Browder v. Gale, that went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled that segregation on buses was unconstitutional. On December 21, 1956, Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy boarded one of the first integrated buses in Montgomery and sat in the front. Montgomery had made King an international figure. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He was suddenly one of the most famous men in America. But his work was just beginning. In 1957, he, Abernathy, and other ministers from across the South formed a new organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, with King as its president. Their goal was to take the spirit of Montgomery and spread it across the South. But the years after Montgomery were difficult. The SCLC struggled to find its footing. The FBI, under its powerful director J. Edgar Hoover, began to take an interest in King, especially his association with a man named Stanley Levison, a New York lawyer and businessman who had past ties to the Communist Party. King was also grappling with the immense pressures of his new fame. In 1958, while signing books in Harlem, he was stabbed in the chest by a mentally ill woman with a letter opener. The blade was lodged so close to his aorta that doctors later told him if he had so much as sneezed, he would have died. While recovering, he received a letter from a young girl that said, "I'm so glad you didn't sneeze." It was a line he would never forget. In 1960, he made the difficult decision to leave Montgomery and move back to Atlanta. He became co-pastor of Ebenezer with his father and could now devote more time to the SCLC, but his return to his father's house also meant a return to their old power struggle. That same year, the movement was reignited, not by King, but by 4 college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, who sat down at a segregated Woolworth's lunch counter and refused to leave. The sit-in movement spread like wildfire across the South, led by a new generation of young, fearless activists. They formed their own organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. King supported them, he inspired them, but he was no longer the only leader on the scene. Some of the students found him too moderate, too cautious. The pressure mounted in 1961 with the Freedom Rides, an audacious attempt by black and white activists to challenge segregation on interstate buses. The riders were met with horrific violence in Alabama. A bus was firebombed. Riders were brutally beaten. King supported the riders, and his church in Montgomery became a sanctuary for them during a riot, but he disappointed many of the young activists when he declined to join the rides himself. He was on probation for a minor traffic violation and feared a long jail sentence. It was a calculated decision, but it created a rift between him and the more militant students that would never fully heal. By 1963, King knew he needed a major victory. The movement had stalled in a difficult campaign in Albany, Georgia, where a savvy police chief had avoided the kind of brutal, headline-grabbing violence that could rally national support. King decided to take the fight to what was then considered the most violently segregated city in America, Birmingham, Alabama. The city was run by a public safety commissioner named Bull Connor, a man who was the complete opposite of the police chief in Albany. Connor was aggressive, crude, and committed to crushing the movement. King and the SCLC launched Project C for confrontation. They organized sit-ins and marches, knowing they would be met with force. King himself was arrested and thrown into solitary confinement. It was there that he read a statement in the local newspaper from 8 white clergymen, calling his protests unwise and untimely. Frustrated and hurt, he began to write a response in the margins of the newspaper, on scraps of toilet paper, on anything he could find. The result was the Letter from Birmingham Jail, one of the most powerful and eloquent defenses of civil disobedience ever written. For years now, he wrote, I have heard the word wait. This, wait, has almost always meant never. We must come to see that justice too long delayed is justice denied. But the letter had no immediate effect. The movement in Birmingham was losing steam. The jails were full. Bail money was running out, and many adults were afraid to protest. It was then that one of King's most radical lieutenants, James Bevel, proposed a shocking idea: let the children march. King was hesitant. The thought of putting children on the front lines, facing Connor's police, was horrifying. But Bevel argued that the children were eager to participate, and their involvement would shame the city and the nation. On May 2, 1963, hundreds of black children, some as young as 6, marched out of the 16th Street Baptist Church, singing freedom songs. They were arrested and hauled off to jail in paddy wagons and school buses. The next day, more children marched. This time, Bull Connor unleashed his weapons. He ordered his men to turn high-pressure fire hoses on the children, blasting them off their feet. He released police dogs, which lunged at the young protesters. The images were broadcast around the world. A photograph of a police dog attacking a young black man appeared on the front page of the New York Times. The world was horrified. President John F. Kennedy, who had been cautious on civil rights, said the images made him, quote, sick. Birmingham had created a crisis that the federal government could no longer ignore. Under pressure, the city's white business leaders agreed to negotiate, and a deal was reached to desegregate downtown stores. Birmingham was a brutal, costly victory, but it changed everything. It forced the Kennedy administration to commit to passing a strong new civil rights bill. And it set the stage for the movement's most iconic moment. A. Philip Randolph, the elder statesman of the movement, had been dreaming of a mass march on Washington for decades. Now, with the momentum from Birmingham, the time was right. On August 28, 1963, more than 250,000 people, black and white, gathered at the Lincoln Memorial for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. King was the last speaker of the day. He had worked late into the night on his speech, a carefully crafted text that spoke of the, quote, promissory note of American democracy that had come back, marked insufficient funds. He was nearing the end of his prepared remarks when the gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, who was sitting behind him, shouted, "Tell him about the dream, Martin! Tell him about the dream!" King had used the "I have a dream" refrain in a speech in Detroit a few months earlier. Now, in front of 250,000 people and a national television audience, he pushed his script aside and began to preach. "I still have a dream," he said, his voice soaring. "It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream." He spoke of a day when his 4 little children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He spoke of a day when Alabama would be transformed into a place where little black boys and black girls could join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. He ended with the words of an old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last." The speech made him not just a leader, but a prophet. But just as the dream seemed within reach, the nightmare returned. 18 days after the march, a bomb exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, killing 4 little girls. 2 months after that, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. "This is what is going to happen to me also," King told Coretta when he heard the news. He was right to be afraid. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, intensified its war against him. Convinced that King was influenced by communists and enraged by King's public criticism of the Bureau, Hoover launched a vicious campaign to expose and neutralize him. Agents tapped his home and office phones. They planted bugs in his hotel rooms. They recorded his conversations, including his extramarital affairs. In late 1964, after King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, the FBI mailed a package to his office. It contained a composite tape of his hotel room encounters and an anonymous, threatening letter. "King, there is only one thing left for you to do," the letter said. "You know what it is. You are done. There is but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation." It was a clear attempt to blackmail him into committing suicide. King and his friends knew it was the FBI. He was terrified, but he refused to be broken. Instead, he turned his attention to the next great battle, voting rights. In early 1965, he brought the SCLC to Selma, Alabama, a city where Sheriff Jim Clark was every bit as brutal as Bull Connor. For weeks, protesters marched to the courthouse to try to register to vote, and for weeks, they were beaten and arrested. King decided to escalate the pressure with a 50-mile march from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery. The first attempt, on March 7, 1965, became known as Bloody Sunday. As 600 marchers, led by John Lewis, crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were brutally attacked by state troopers with clubs and tear gas. King was in Atlanta that day, but the images of the violence once again shocked the nation. President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had a much deeper commitment to civil rights than Kennedy, was outraged. He went before a joint session of Congress to propose a strong new voting rights bill. In a speech that brought tears to King's eyes as he watched on television, Johnson adopted the anthem of the movement. "Their cause must be our cause too," the president said. "And we shall overcome." The march to Montgomery finally took place, protected by federal troops. It was a triumphant moment, a shining moment, King said. That summer, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law. In many ways, it was the peak of the civil rights movement. In just a decade, the movement had toppled the legal structure of Jim Crow in the South. But King knew the fight was far from over. The victories in the South had done little to address the crushing poverty, slum housing, and police brutality faced by black people in the northern cities. In 1966, he made the controversial decision to take the movement north to Chicago. He and his family moved into a dilapidated apartment on the city's west side to experience the conditions of the ghetto firsthand. Chicago was a different kind of battle. There was no obvious villain like Bull Connor. There were no clear-cut segregation laws to protest. The enemy was a more subtle systemic racism, enforced not by whites-only signs, but by discriminatory real estate practices and political machines. When King led marches into all-white neighborhoods, he was met with a hatred even more vicious than what he had seen in Mississippi. Mobs of white residents hurled rocks, bottles, and bricks. King himself was struck by a rock. "I've never seen anything like it in my life," he said. "I think the people of Mississippi ought to come to Chicago to learn how to hate." The Chicago campaign ended in a messy, complicated compromise that many felt was a defeat. It was a brutal lesson for King. He realized that changing laws was one thing, but changing hearts and deeply entrenched economic systems was another. At the same time, the movement was fracturing. A new generation of activists, led by Stokely Carmichael, was growing impatient with nonviolence. They raised the cry of "Black Power," a slogan that frightened many white allies and troubled King. He understood their anger, their desire for self-determination, but he feared that a turn towards separatism and violence would be self-destructive. And then there was Vietnam. King had grown increasingly tormented by the war. He saw it as a moral catastrophe, a drain on the resources that were desperately needed to fight poverty at home. His advisors warned him that speaking out would alienate President Johnson and destroy his relationship with the White House. But his conscience would not let him remain silent. On April 4, 1967, exactly 1 year before his death, he stepped into the pulpit of Riverside Church in New York and delivered his most controversial speech. He called the United States government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. The backlash was immediate and overwhelming. Newspapers that had once praised him now condemned him. The NAACP and other civil rights leaders distanced themselves from him. President Johnson was furious. King was now more isolated than ever. Donations to the SCLC dried up. His popularity plummeted. He felt depressed, exhausted, and unsure of the way forward. He told Coretta, "People expect me to have answers, and I don't have any answers." But out of this despair came his final, most radical vision, the Poor People's Campaign. He proposed to bring an army of the poor, black, white, Hispanic, Native American, to Washington, D.C. They would build a shanty town and engage in massive civil disobedience to disrupt the functioning of the government until Congress passed an economic Bill of Rights for all poor Americans. It was a call not just for civil rights, but for a, quote, radical reconstruction of society itself, a revolution of values. It was a desperate, audacious plan, and many, including his own staff, thought it was doomed to fail. In the midst of this planning, a call came from Memphis, Tennessee. The city's black sanitation workers were on strike, protesting miserable pay and dangerous working conditions. Their leader was his old friend, James Lawson. They needed his help. King was exhausted, but he couldn't say no. He felt a deep connection to the struggle of these poor working men. Their fight was his fight. He led a march in Memphis that turned violent, not because of the strikers, but because of a small group of young people who began smashing windows. King was devastated. The media portrayed it as his failure, proof that his philosophy of nonviolence was dead. He was determined to go back to Memphis and lead a peaceful march, to prove that nonviolence could still work. On the night of April 3, 1968, a thunderstorm raged outside Mason Temple in Memphis. King was feeling sick and had asked Abernathy to speak in his place. But Abernathy called him from the church. "The people who are here want you, not me." King went. He spoke without notes, his voice weary but full of power. He talked about the bomb threat on his plane that morning. He talked about the many threats on his life. "Well, I don't know what will happen now," he said. "We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." The next evening, April 4, 1968, he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. He was joking with his friends in the parking lot below. He asked the musician Ben Branch to play his favorite hymn, "Take My Hand, Precious Lord," at the meeting that night. As he turned to go back into his room, a single shot rang out. He was 39 years old. When we think of Martin Luther King Jr., it's easy to picture the monument in Washington, D.C., a stoic, larger-than-life figure carved from a mountain of despair. Jonathan Eig's biography, King: A Life, does something remarkable. It chips away at that stone, not to tear it down, but to reveal the living, breathing, and often struggling human being inside. And in doing so, it makes his legacy more powerful, not less. The first profound lesson from this book is the power of embracing our own imperfections. We've been taught to see our heroes as saints, as people born with a level of courage and clarity that we could never possess. But Eig shows us a Martin who was plagued by doubt, who battled depression, who was unfaithful to his wife, and who often felt overwhelmed by the burden of leadership. And yet, it was this same man who found the strength to face down death threats, to comfort the grieving, and to offer a vision of love in a nation consumed by hate. His greatness wasn't in his perfection. It was in his persistent struggle to be better, to live up to the ideals he preached, even when he fell short. It teaches us that heroism isn't the absence of flaws, it's the courage to act in spite of them. The second key insight is that we have profoundly misunderstood his dream. We have frozen him in 1963, quoting his beautiful lines about little black children and little white children holding hands, and we have conveniently forgotten where his journey led him. The Martin Luther King Jr. of 1968 was a far more radical and challenging figure. He had come to see that Jim Crow wasn't just a Southern problem. It was an American problem. He saw that racial injustice was inextricably linked to economic injustice and to the violence of militarism. His call for a revolution of values wasn't just a call for people to be nicer to each other. It was a demand for a fundamental restructuring of our society. He challenged the very foundations of American capitalism and foreign policy. We have turned a radical profit into a comfortable holiday, and in doing so, we have avoided the difficult questions he was asking us at the end of his life, questions about poverty, wealth, and war that are more relevant today than ever. Finally, this book is a powerful reminder of the true meaning of nonviolence. We often mistake it for passivity, for simply turning the other cheek. But for King, nonviolence was a weapon. It was, as he called it, a sword that heals. It wasn't about avoiding conflict. It was about creating it. It was about creating a crisis, a tension, so dramatic that a community that has refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. From the Montgomery Bus Boycott to the marches in Birmingham and Selma, King's genius was in forcing America to look at its own ugliness in the mirror. He knew that unearned suffering is redemptive, not just for the person suffering, but for the soul of the nation that allows it to happen. So, what can we take from this incredible life? You don't have to be perfect to make a difference. Your vision for a better world should grow and evolve as you learn and experience more. And courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act for a cause greater than your own fear. That was a summary of King: A Life by Jonathan Eig. We've touched on the major moments and themes today, but I'll be honest with you. A summary can only ever be a map. The real journey happens when you walk the path yourself. The true power of this book lies in the small details, the private letters, the newly revealed conversations that bring this incredible man to life in a way I could never fully capture here. This summary is designed to help you decide if this story is worth your time. If anything we've talked about has sparked something in you, I urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just an act of learning. It's an experience that can genuinely change how you see leadership, courage, and the ongoing struggle for a better world. A link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know that these deep dives matter, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book. Let's keep growing and learning together.